guys hear me? Oh, there. It just turned on. Cool. All right, so I'm going to go get started. Thanks for coming to my talk called Clicking Too Many Slides Ahead. It's called The System is the Message, Dynamic Narrative in the Novelist. The slides are going to be available very soon at that URL down at the bottom, and that URL is also on the last slide, so don't worry about taking pictures or anything. Please silence your cell phones and also make sure to fill out your evaluation forms. So a quick bit about me. I started my career at Iron Storm Austin, where I worked on a handful of games before going to Midway Austin, where I worked on a game that was never announced and got canceled while Midway Austin went down. After that, I went to 2K Marin, where I shipped BioShock 2, and after that, I went to LucasArts, where I worked on a game that never got announced and eventually left that game to go indie, and I almost forgot my sign to myself that reminds me to slow down. So I'm going to put this up here because I really sometimes talk too fast. So there we go. Now we're set. So that's a little bit about me, and 3 years ago, I gave a talk here at GDC entitled Player-Driven Stories, How Do We Get There? And I highlighted a problem where games aren't taking advantage of the interactivity of our medium, and I was kind of pushing back against the more and more linear stories, more and more Hollywood copying type stuff, and really pushing for the player to have more control over stories in games. And the goal I set forth is a story in which the player makes influential decisions that create a unique narrative that's not prescribed by a designer. And by influential, I mean decisions that actually matter, not just cosmetic things or not things that close a quick loop after that, but really have a lasting impact on the narrative. And the second word I want to highlight is actually that word narrative. This is a cohesive series of events that form a long-term, satisfying story, not just isolated micro-level events. And if you want, you can actually watch that talk. It's free on the GDC Vault, so if you're interested, check it out. But when I gave this talk, it was pretty much theoretical. It wasn't related to any specific game I was working on. It was just more like a call to action that I wanted to see happen. And even after I went indie, I didn't immediately start addressing this problem or thinking about a game that dealt with it. I actually started working on a puzzle game that I pretty quickly gave up because I realized I didn't care at all about it. And so I decided I would take a crack at trying to do something with actual player-driven stories. So I moved to a new idea that just had a working title called Ghost. And it's what eventually became The Novelist, but it started off as a very different thing. It was 6 people in an oceanside mansion after one of their friends had died, sort of like in The Big Chill. And you did play a ghost in the house, and you could creep around, and you could learn about them. You could manipulate their relationships. You could create and destroy romances, make people friends, uncover past secrets, so-and-so. And the idea was that if I give the player lots of control over these 6 characters, then a story would just magically emerge. And I sort of built this toy-like simulation. So I built a prototype in Unity, and I got it up and running, and there was 6 characters in this house. I named them after characters in one of my favorite movies, which is Halloween. So we had Annie, we had Bob, we had Linda, we had Annie's boyfriend, Paul, who never appears on screen, so here's where Bob gets killed. And I also had the 2 characters from one of the great video game love stories, Rebecca and Tommy from System Shock 2. So those are my 6 characters, and I built it, and it worked. And you could make 2 characters fall in love. You could create and destroy romances. You could make people friends and stuff, but it didn't really have any impact. There was nothing to it that really had any emotional resonance. There was no emotional hook. There were too many characters, and you could manipulate them in too many ways. And so numbers moved around, and you could check a status screen that said, oh, these people are now friends, or these people are starting to dislike each other, or whatever. But there was no on-screen meaning. There was no story emerging from this. And I realized that without enough backstory and without enough context, that this was basically just a group of systems from which no kind of actual meaningful narrative would emerge. Or, as I called it in my 2011 talk, system soup, which is basically the idea that you have a lot of stuff going on, and a bunch of stuff's happening, but it has no real form and it has no real meaning. So next, I decided to drastically reduce the number of characters in the game down to 3 and provide a really clear context so that players would have a framework for understanding their decisions. So 3 characters is kind of the lowest you can go and still have interesting push-pull kind of dynamics. And I picked a family because that's something that's universally known to everybody. You know what it's like to be a kid. You know what it's like to have a romantic relationship. A lot of people know what it's like to be a parent. And so even if you haven't done a couple of those things, you still understand what it is. So I didn't have to spend a lot of time providing with context and backstory. You understand immediately what would make a good or bad relationship, what would make a good or bad dad. So I kind of tried to do that to address the shortcomings of that first prototype and to explain a little bit more about the game at a high level. It's about a family named the Kaplans, and Dan is a writer. His book is not going very well. Linda is his wife, who's a painter, and their marriage is kind of on the rocks. And their son, Tommy, is a kid who just went through his first year of school, and he had a really tough time. He got picked on by some bullies. He struggled a little bit with his reading. So they've kind of come to this summer home to get away and try to figure things out. And you play as a ghost, and you explore the house, and you read their thoughts and read their memories and discover what they want, and you uncover these dilemmas, and you actually start to help them decide how to resolve them. So I'm going to quickly play the trailer for the game, just for people who haven't played it, just to, it gives a pretty good idea of actually what you can do in the game and what it looks like to play it. So I'll just start that now. So that's how the game works, and I am really, really sick of that song. I want to talk about a couple of my goals for the game. The high-level goal was to try an experimental form of storytelling where I take the relationship simulation of something like a Sim-style game, but manipulate it to present it as a recognizable traditional story. So you're not necessarily managing meters between characters and looking a lot of on-screen HUD, but you're taking those same types of dynamics and trying to turn it into a story. So the first step there is the abdication of authorship. I wanted to abdicate authorship and put the story in the player's hands. And this is really important because this story is about trying to balance your career with your family, and that's a really big question. What are the right answers there? And I'd be lying if I said I knew what was important. So my goal wasn't for the game to be a platform for my own beliefs. Instead, my goal was to make it a question game, not a message game. The game doesn't give the player a specific goal or judge whether the decisions are right or wrong. It just lets the player make choices and try to give them reasonable consequences and kind of feedback the effects of their decisions. So what I really wanted to do was create a dynamic narrative, not necessarily a branching plot. I wanted to create a narrative that was based solely on the player's input as opposed to a branching plot where every player has the same series of events and choices. So I think it'd be useful to quickly establish what I mean by a branching plot. A branching plot is created by a writer or designer, and though the player does make some decisions, the events come in the same order every time. So the plot starts moving along, and at some point the player reaches a decision point, and they're given multiple options. Maybe they have to choose between different missions, or align with one of two factions, or even decide if a character lives or dies. And this technique is used very frequently in games like Mass Effect or the BioShock series, very familiar. So the player decides what they want to do, and there are now two branches of the story. And these are both authored content that are based on that choice. And the player might be given another major decision along one of these branches. So they decide again, and the first choice might fold back into the branch coming from the new choice, but eventually things probably fold back together towards the end, and you're presented with one final decision that once you choose there, it splits the it splits out to different endings for different players. And this is frequently done on a sort of good, neutral, or bad ending. That's not the case all the time, but it's a pretty common trope there. And before going on, I want to be clear that this is a perfectly valid structure for a game plot. My talk is not a screed against this kind of plot. I wanted to do something differently, but these plots can always obviously work very well in games and give player really memorable experiences where they make choices that are really powerful to them. So I just want to make sure that this doesn't come off as me trashing this kind of branching narrative, because I think it's fine. But in my game, I did want to impose as little pre-authored structure as possible from my angle. So instead of writing a story, and even a story with a bunch of choices, I instead wanted to create narrative systems from which a player-driven story would emerge. So actually a systems-based narrative. So I made a bunch of structural decisions to try to make this happen. And the first and maybe most important one is that the chapters in the game come in a random order on each playthrough. So I actually sort of burned the boats and literally prevented myself from being able to author a traditional branching plot. Like, I could not if I tried, because when this chapter comes up, I don't know if this has happened here, or what the player did here, or what the player did here. So I actively prevented myself from being able to create that kind of narrative. I simply don't know what comes before or after. And so that provided a lot of constraints on the actual chapter design, but each chapter became sort of a self-contained building block for the larger narrative. The second point is that I wanted relationships to be the sort of core thread and the core connective tissue between chapters, not a series of plot events. And finally, I wanted to create a framework that's based on player values as the authorship of the game. I wanted to create something where the player has to make personal decisions to create this story. So I tried to take each chapter and make each of the decisions the player has to make equally sympathetic from the different perspectives in the game. I didn't want players to get to a chapter and say, oh, this is clearly the right answer, or this is the good versus evil answer, or obviously I should do this. I kind of wanted them to have to be sympathetic to all characters and have to say, wow, what do I really think is right here? What do I think is more important here? So again, it's a question game, not a message game. And more specifically, it's a game about trying to balance your career and your dreams with your family. So all of your decisions are based on making choices that prioritize one of these things here. And the high concept is essentially a game with 9 chapters, each of which asks you to make a decision on these axes in a slightly different way. And the hope being that you'll end up with a set of relationships at the end of the game that reflects your own choices on that subject, and that the story is almost like a mirror to help you process your own values on this specific question. So I want to walk through an example chapter just to make sure it's clear how the game works so that we'll have a vocabulary going forward. In each chapter, you spend time sneaking around the house and trying to remain hidden. And so you read things the characters have written. You look at things that Tommy has drawn. You read the characters' thoughts to see what they're thinking about. You even explore their memories and relive past conversations and past events. And all these things help you piece together what's going on in each chapter. So you have a discovery phase where you uncover this type of stuff. And each character has their own chain of clues. And so what you want to do is basically find enough clues for each character to discover how they want to resolve the dilemma in the chapter. So to use an example of a chapter called The Show, in this chapter, Linda is going to be putting on an art show in town, and she's really under the gun trying to finish a last piece before the art show goes live. And she's asked Dan to help her with some promo materials, and also asked if she could if he could help her find an agent. But meanwhile, Dan is behind on his own deadline. His agent's writing him. He's dodging phone calls, and he's got a big deadline due Monday, and he's super under the gun himself and doesn't have the time to do it. And finally, to make matters worse, he had also promised their son Tommy that they were going to go to the beach that day and look for a conch shell and just have a nice Saturday at the beach. So everything has to be done that weekend, and there's not enough time to do it all. And the game is told from Dan's perspective. So it's presented as a series of choices like these where he can't do everything he wants to do, and you have to pick what's more important. So after you uncover all the clues, you basically have to decide whether Dan should help with the promo forms, and so Linda can focus on her last painting and kind of support her in her career. So you see there, she's thinking, he could take care of those promo forms for me, and that would obviously help the marriage. Or you could look at him just basically going into crunch mode over the weekend and chaining himself to his typewriter to work on his book, which of course helps his career and helps his novel. Or he could blow off both of those things and take Tommy on the beach trip, which is good for his role as a parent. So in this case, let's say the player chooses to prioritize Dan and Linda's marriage and work on the promo forms. These decisions are fed back to the player through a series of short scenes that kind of tell you the impact of what happened. So here we can see that Dan and Linda are working on the forms together, and it kind of explains, I don't know how easy that is to read, but it basically goes on to say the art show was a big hit, the ad in the paper did a lot to help that happen, and it was good that he helped her, and it was really a big boost for her, and it was awesome that he was a supportive husband, and that's really cool. However, Tommy didn't get his beach trip, so he spends Saturday looking out the window being super sad, and that's kind of a bummer. And then Dan also misses his deadline because he spent the time supporting his wife, and he gets chewed out by his agent, and his book kind of goes a little bit more in the gutter. So again, the narrative's constructed from the history of the player's choices on these specific topics. And so the starting point of the next chapter, in this case, would be a better marriage because he helped her with the promo forms, an unhappier child because he broke that promise to his kid, and a worse book because he missed his deadline. And these relationships are the spine of the story, so I decided that I would build a really simple simulation of them. So each of those relationships is scored from 0 to 9, with 0 being the worst and 9 being the best. And at the beginning of the game, they're all rated at 5, so everything comes in even. And in the example we just looked at, where Dan supported Linda at the expense of his work and his relationship to his son, the marriage score goes up to 7, while his career score and his relationship to Tommy each drop to 4. And these numbers are never revealed to the player. They're actually fed back through a variety of other means that I'll go into a little bit later, but it's important to know that this is all under the hood. So the relationship scores, like I said, are the connective tissue that carry forward from chapter to chapter in the game. And the next decision that the player makes will be based on starting with these new values. So if you plot that change over time, it basically looks like this. Each decision makes a relationship get noticeably better or slightly worse. And so this little Pac-Man mouth is sort of the atomic unit of the story. Every decision functions on these relationships one way or another, either making it pretty much better or slightly worse. So the way this works over the course of the game is that if you look at a game with 9 chapters and they all start at 5, this is the sort of possibility space of any given relationship over the game. These are the possible decisions that could happen. So by the end of the second chapter, any relationship in the game can actually already reach its maximal value, because it's 5 plus 2 is 7 plus 2 is 9. So Dan's book could be the next War and Peace, or he and Linda could be on a perpetual honeymoon, or he could also be the greatest dad in the world. So if we keep going a little further, you see that from each one of these points, additional decisions can be made and continue to build out. And by the 5th chapter, any relationship that's been completely neglected can hit rock bottom. It can actually get to the worst shape possible if you have ignored that, either ignored his book or ignored his wife or ignored his son the whole time. So we follow forward, and the decisions pile on decisions, and this represents the full possibility space for any single relationship in the game. And if you compare that to the branching plot diagram, it actually looks pretty impressive, right? There's so much stuff you can do, but it's actually not. This is kind of a mess. It's too granular for most of these data points to mean anything, and since the numbers are never shown to the player, a lot of this detail is irrelevant. So while there might be a big possibility space, it's very hard to tease a lot of meaning out of this. And in fact, it's just a different form of the thing I was trying to avoid, which is systems soup. So when I realized that, I knew the next challenge was to basically take these numbers that were under the hood and very granular and not fed back very well, and overlay a lot of sort of human readable context to let players know where they were standing and where these relationships were. So here are some of the methods that I used to feed this stuff back. First off, the player can basically read the character's thoughts and just see what the relationship statuses are. So here's one where Tommy is bummed out about his dad. They don't have a very good relationship, and so he's saying, "Oh, mommy said daddy's just too busy." So things aren't going well, and you can kind of read, "Oh, wow, that kind of hurts. Maybe I should give Tommy a little love in this chapter." You can also explore the character's memories and find diaries where they react to previous decisions. So here's a diary where Linda's really excited about how things went with her art show, and you kind of get that payoff of how elated she is that things went well for her. Tommy also does drawings to represent his relationship with his father. So this is when things are going really good. He draws a happy pictures. Dad's got his arm around him. Here's when things are kind of just okay. They're just kind of standing there like, "Hey, we exist." And then this is when things are going really badly. His dad is like this screaming monster, and he looks sad. He's giving this "what do I do" thing. So it basically shows you the different range of drawings that Tommy can make. I also did a thing where there are objects left around from previous chapters in the house. So this newspaper clipping on the wall only comes up if you do the art show with Linda, And if you go read it, it's basically a notice that says, local artist or visiting artist, Linda Kaplan, put on a great show, blah, blah, blah. So it kind of gives you a little bit of payoff to remind you of your past decisions. And over the course of the game, these objects build up across the house and sort of create a unique landscape of the decisions you've made represented by these physical objects. Another example would be if you had actually taken Tommy to the beach, that conch shell would now be on his bedside table for the rest of the game. Another one is that when characters pass each other in the house, they'll greet each other. So if things are going really well with Dan and Linda, they'll have a really happy greeting. They'll maybe talk about taking a break together or going into town to get something to eat. If things are just going okay, it's a lot more perfunctory. It's just like, hey, oh, hey. And if things are going bad, they barely acknowledge each other, and it sounds really icy and pretty tough. So just ambiently around the house, you can kind of hear some representations of those relationships. And if things get really bad, characters will actually start locking themselves in their rooms. So this is Tommy in his room alone, playing with his toys, sad because his dad's neglecting him. And Linda can do the same in her studio, and there's also some scenarios where Dan can do that in his office. And then this is my favorite one, which I don't think anyone's ever noticed in the world, but I like it. Dan's trash can. If things are going really good on his book, there's almost no crumbled up paper in his trash can. But as things start to go worse, it fills back in, and each chapter, it kind of represents the status of his book by how many bad pages are curled up and thrown on the floor. And I don't know. Now at least some people know that that exists. So these things are all good at giving the player status updates. That's good. It's information. The player knows how these relationships are standing, but we still don't have a story. We still have 9 flat chapters without any highs or lows, and you just sort of manipulate these relationships, but it's just the same sort of flow over and over again. And one of the key benefits of an authored story is that the writer can make sure the story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. They can make sure to modulate the intensity of the events and create some dramatic ebb and flow so that the story has some structure and players are kept more interested, and you kind of have these big events, and then you release with some pressure, or release the pressure and then build up to another big event, and basically modulate the flow so players don't get fatigued, but they also feel structure. And there are a lot of ways to do this, but one of the most basic is the traditional 3-act structure, which is a very simple way of creating rising and falling action over time and building to a climax and resolution. Now, this is super, super basic. It's not innovative at all, and a lot of writers actually advocate moving away from it and going to more advanced forms. But in the case of my game, given the difficulty of trying to create a narrative out of these really unpredictable systems where I don't know what order the events are going to happen in, I don't know what the player's going to choose each time, I actually felt that having something that's very identifiable and very recognizable in a form that people get would actually help. So this did not feel like the place for me to try to do something weird. I actually thought the game benefited from having a really simple, defined structure based on the 3 acts. So the more familiarity and form I could add to the story, I felt that was better. So if we look at our map of the possibility space again and slice it to have 3 acts and a climax, then we can start to see like specific points in the narrative and the timeline that we start to build up to. And if we slice it into 3 acts, we can also zero in on where those relationship scores can be at any of these points in the story. So we start to identify, I want to punch things up here, and this is sort of where things can be at this time. And we can start to isolate places to put bigger and more memorable moments in the story to try to give it those peaks and valleys. And I used the 3-act structure as a guide to introduce more drama at known intervals. And the way I did that was I made chapters 3 and 6 and 8 higher stakes dilemmas. They were generally more, emotionally involving chapters, and each one of them focused on a different character. And then chapter 9 is the finale, so it sort of has the highest stakes of all. And since the game takes place over one summer, I felt like there was a natural rhythm to it where I could just say, well, June is Act 1, July is Act 2, and August is Act 3, culminating with them leaving the house and going forward into the future. So I started to do this, but I realized, so the bottle is an example of one of these high-stakes chapters. It's one where Dan's drinking problem is getting a little bit out of control. His wife's worried about him. His son's upset because he's not paying enough attention to him. And I decided to set all these high-stakes chapters at night. The game has different times of day, so I figured why not make it at night, make it feel more ominous, make it feel more heavy. And so I made sure to put these at chapters 3, 6, and 9. They're still randomly selected. There's a bucket of these, and I put a random one at each time, so it's not like I really structure it that much. But I just make sure that something big happens at these key points in the story. And I also make sure that after that, it pulls from the bucket of lower stakes chapters, so that you kind of get some peaks and then a little bit of release of that tension. And in addition, this was another thing that I added after a lot of playtest feedback, was after each one of these high-stakes chapters, you get an additional set of these narrative wrap-up scenes that give you sort of a roll-up on the overall relationship status of all these axes that aren't related to any specific chapter. So they take place completely off-screen, and they serve as a summary of all the choices the players made up to this point. So it's not just, here's how people reacted to the choice you just made for this chapter, but here's where your relationships stand based on all of your choices so far. So it wasn't feasible scope-wise, obviously, to create scenes for every possible relationship score. It might have worked okay at the first because there's not that many options, but by the second act and certainly by the third act, there would literally be 10 options for both because every relationship could be everywhere, and that's completely unsustainable from a scope, especially from one dude making a game in his apartment. So that wasn't necessarily a problem, though, because these would be so granular anyways that I'm not sure the player would know the difference between what's a 6 relationship and what's a 7 relationship. So what I did was I broke this up into bands that basically denoted different relationship values, and then broke those down into 8 and 9 are good, 6 and 7, or 8 and 9 is great, 6 or 7 is good, 3, 4, and 5 are bad, and 0, 1, and 2 are awful. So I broke it down into categories to kind of make them work more manageable, but also because that way they would actually make sense to characters. You can tell the difference between good and bad a lot more than you can tell the difference between 4 and 5 or something like that. So it basically preserved the granular relationship scoring under the hood while compressing the dynamic range of the player feedback into something that was more meaningful to players. So here's an example of some of those scenes. You start off with a little intro that says, hey, the first month is done, and a lot of stuff had happened. And then you get 3 scenes that tell you the status of these relationships based on all of the decisions up to this point. So, for example, after the end of the first act, Dan sends his work in progress to his agent, and his agent comes back and says, oh, wow, this is really great. This is awesome. So you know that Dan's book is going well at the end of the first act of the game. Dan and Linda go into town for a date, and the date goes really well. So you can say, oh, man, I guess they really are hitting it off. I'm so glad I'm saving this relationship as the player based on the choices I made. But here's a sad story, where Dan took Tommy out of the woods to look for arrowheads, and basically as soon as they got there, he said, okay, come on, we're going home, and Tommy was crying, and Dan didn't care. And so it basically says that, yeah, he's up to this point being a very neglectful father. And there are 4 different versions of each of these scenes, so, depending on where those relationships are in those zones, then you get one of those 4 scenes, and that's a lot more manageable than 10 scenes each time, and arguably it's more readable to the player. And they really explicitly tell you how things are going. So you get these at the end of, you have these big high-stakes chapters, and then you get a roll-up that says, here you are in the story, here's where it is. And you're like, wow, end of a month, and it kind of gives you a good place to stop. Like a lot of people will play an act and then put the game down, then play the next act, put the game down. So it really did a good job of starting to split the game up into a more definable structure so that there was some rising and falling action. So once I got to this point, the system was actually in pretty good shape. Players understood how their decisions and actions were creating the story. I was starting to get to a discernible narrative flow, and there was a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the players had an emotional connection to the experience. And I was happy for a while, but unfortunately, while the core system was pretty solid, it started to reveal some limitations. And these started to come mostly from players' sort of natural expectations regarding how human beings would actually react in some of these scenarios. So let's take a look at a scenario where the player focuses on Dan and Linda's marriage with some focus on Dan's novel and puts no love towards Tommy. So this graph is going to show all 3 relationships as they progress through a given playthrough. So you see them developing, series of choices, +2 or down 1, depending on what's going on. And if the player makes a series of choices that gets to this point, then the marriage score is at an 8. So Dan and Linda are madly in love. Their marriage is going great. They're really reconnecting. But then you look down here, and Tommy's at a 0. His dad is being terrible to him. He has ignored him through literally the entire game. He's neglecting him. Tommy is starting to get traumatized. And then I realized that, I had put in these feedback systems that I showed earlier, right, that said how things are going. And so the player actually really knows what these relationships are. And I started to see these incongruities when things started to reach the extremes of this dynamic range. So it simply wasn't realistic to have in the same chapter Dan saying, oh, man, I should make Linda breakfast in bed. And Linda saying, I hope we didn't wake up Tommy last night. So obviously their marriage is going really well. But then Tommy's sitting in this room with the door closed saying, why is my dad such a bully? It's hard to imagine Linda being madly in love with her husband at the same time that he's being this awful, awful father. So once you move to the edges of this range, these things can start to conflict with each other in ways that really started to jump out. So since the player has no control over Tommy or Linda, then they have to have some level of autonomy in the way that they deal with these relationships. And so the solution I came up with was that, in this case, Linda would actually speak up for Tommy. And if the roles were reversed, Tommy would speak up for Linda. So let's rewind this just a little bit and get to the same decision point here and apply these same scoring zones that I was using for the act break wrap-ups. So we can use these inflection points as triggers to know when the characters should speak up for each other. So, for example, Linda sees that Tommy has just crossed into the awful zone, like things are going really bad, and she decides to do something about it. So in this scenario, instead of her wanting her desired outcome in a vacuum, which is what we saw before, she says, wow, I wish Dan could take care of those promo forms so I could work on my painting. Instead, she says, he shouldn't worry about those promo forms. He really should take Tommy to get that shell. She speaks up for Tommy and tells the player very explicitly, hey, this is what I want, but I don't want you to do it. I want you to take care of your son. So this is like a feedback mechanism in the game, and it was originally just intended to make the characters more believable. But I quickly realized that I had to incorporate those intentions back into the simulation itself. It wasn't good enough for them to just speak up. So in a normal case, obviously, if none of the relationships are in the awful zone and nothing's been triggered, then each character just wants what they want in a vacuum, like we saw with Linda before. But here, Linda has changed her mind and says she wants Dan to pay attention to their son, not do what she would actually normally want. So if the player listens to Linda's request and goes and plays with Tommy, Tommy gets the normal 2-point boost. That pulls his relationship back out of the awful band. It's still bad, but it's better than nothing. But the key thing is that Linda doesn't take the normal 1-point hit. Which stands to reason. She was very clear about what she wanted, and she said, my desire is for you to put Tommy in front of my own needs, and it would be a really bad simulation if the player got such a clear message from Linda, did what Linda wanted, and then she still turned around and got mad at him for not doing what she wanted. So in essence, the simulation allows Linda to forgive Dan in conditional cases where she had actually said, hey, you know what I want isn't the most important thing right now. And on the flip side, if we look at the same situation, and Linda says, you should take care of your son, forget my promo forms, and Dan says, shut up, I'm doing the promo forms anyways, then Tommy's relationship score still takes that 1-point hit. It still gets worse because he still got ignored. But Linda also takes the hit. She gets angry about it. She says, I told you, you jerk, pay attention to your son, and you just went and did this anyways. How deaf are you? And there are actually conditional outcomes for all the chapters that address this. If you go either way in this scenario, then in the next chapter it's fed back, and she says, I really would have liked to have help with that, but I'm so glad that Tommy and Dan had a good time at the beach, and blah, blah, blah. So, and this works both ways. If Linda's relationship gets really low and Tommy's is high, then he'll say, I don't want to go to the beach. Go make up with Mommy. So they kind of regulate for each other because since, the player doesn't have direct control over them in the way they do over Dan, they have to have some level of autonomy. So I had to modify the simulation sum to account for edge cases and also to make sure that the simulation stayed believable. And I was happy with how the characters that the player can't control started to behave in these scenarios. And in general, the system seemed really tight. But there was something that still bothered me, and it started causing a lot of complaints for playtesters as well. And that's the fact that, and this is probably the biggest one that really took a lot of thought, is the relationships system is zero sum. The player starts with 15 points in the system, and every choice just reassigns the same number of points. So 5 plus 5 plus 5 equals 15, so does 7 plus 4 plus 4. So over the course of a game, you start, everybody's at level 5, which is at the top of the bad zone. That's why they're here. Things aren't going too well for any of them. And then in a zero-sum system, the player is just spending this entire game rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So to improve one relationship, you have to make the other two worse. And so as you go through the game, you're just moving around the same 15 relationship points, making one score better and the other score is worse. And so in this example, for Dan to write a great book, he has to be an awful father, and he ends up in the exact same spot with Linda. They're both at a 5, it's kind of bad, and nothing has happened. So it's this really, really nihilistic viewpoint from the systems design, right? You're just saying, like, wow, you just have this set reserve of emotional energy that you can't spread around, and you can't make any extra effort, and life is just sort of this, I don't know, ugly thing. And so players started responding to this, and I was like, oh, well, because in my head, I was just like, oh, this is so simple and beautiful. It's +2, -1 every time, and it just stays, but then I asked myself, when I'm mapping this to relational context, does that represent real life? Is there really no way that you can have a good career and have a good family? I was like, I know friends that do this. Like, I know it's not impossible. And I didn't think that was the right message for the game to send. And I had this realization where I'd done everything I could to abdicate authorship in terms of the narrative content. I tried my hardest. I'm sure I didn't succeed everywhere, but I tried my hardest to make all these situations very sympathetic. In every chapter, you said, oh, I can see why Linda would want this. I would see why Dan would want this, and I could see why Tommy wanted this, and it's up to you, the player, to decide. I tried to make that as balanced as possible. But when I hit this problem with the zero-sum system, I realized that I couldn't abdicate authorship from the game as a whole. I'd only relocated my authorship from the narrative content to the actual design of the narrative simulation. And further, I created a game that was sending a message that I never intended. I had built this relationship simulation, and I felt like Clark Griswold when he plugs in the Christmas lights and the house doesn't light up. The system design had become the implicit message of the game, and I was basically telling players, you can't have it all. Life is zero-sum. You cannot win. And it was this really brutal bummer of a game, that unintentional, and so I'm sitting there like, why are the lights not coming on? But yeah, so it was really upsetting. And the biggest thing is, like, I don't believe that perspective to be true. I believe you can put in the extra effort and have a better life. So people were taking this message from the game that I fundamentally disagreed with. And I was like, oh my God, I made this, and I don't agree with it. And I realized I was editorializing through systems design. Like, the actual design of the system had become the message of the game. So I knew I had to make a change, and I started talking to my friends and thinking about people who actually do seem to have it all, people who are successful at their jobs and have a loving wife and have a great relationship with their kids. And I asked myself, how do they do it? And the answer is actually pretty simple. They just try harder. If a parent misses their kid's soccer practice, then they might take their kid out for ice cream the next day or take them to a movie to make up for it. Or if you can't make time to have dinner with your partner, maybe you buy them a little gift somewhere in the week, or maybe cook them a surprise meal later to make up for it and say, hey, I knew I couldn't make it when we wanted to, but you're still important. I want to show it. And everybody knows that you can't please everyone all the time, but if you do those extra things, you actually can have a good relationship over time by sort of, a friend of mine said a really great thing, which was, the goal isn't to live a balanced week, it's to live a balanced life. So it's just an acknowledgement that, you can't please everyone in every situation. If you miss a deadline at work, maybe you stay later to work on it. So you find ways to put in the extra effort and make these things go a little better. So that's where the compromise system came into the game. And the goal I had was I wanted to map the concept of extra effort in life to extra effort and skillfulness in the game. And so for extra effort, I decided that the player would have to go down a character's entire clue chain and find their clue and understand what they wanted to do in order to earn a compromise with them. And for skillfulness, they had to also remain unspotted. So they had to make it through the entire chapter. It's a stealth game without being spotted, so you can't upset the character too much. They've still got to be in a good place. And if you do both of those things, you earn the ability to create a compromise with them. So remember the scene of Tommy sitting by the window where he's sad because his dad decided to do the promo forms instead and broke the promise to him? Well, now I implemented a system where if you discover his clue, find out what he wants to do, and you remain unspotted, then you get the ability to have a compromise with Tommy. And so even if he can't take Tommy down to the beach for the whole day, he can at least work late and make a little extra time to take him for an hour and a half. And it's not all that Tommy wanted, but it does show Tommy that he's loved and that, Dan is trying, and he's trying to, do better for everybody. And just like Linda speaking up for Tommy in the example before, this needed to be reflected in the simulation itself. So in the relationship system as it stood, choosing Dan and Linda's marriage would cause a 1-point drop on the novel and on parenthood. But in the updated simulation, if the player finds a compromise that lets Dan make it up to Tommy in some way, then the parenthood score would actually stay the same and not decrease by 1, which, if you notice, all of a sudden adds a point to the system. I just think of them as happiness points because the more you have, the sort of happier you can distribute them through the system. And so whenever you start adding points to the system and using compromises effectively, you can actually please everyone and get a happy ending to the game. So remember our atomic unit of every decision in the game, where something either goes up by 2 or down by 1. Well, now we added in a third option where things could also stay the same. And if you spread those out over time, you can actually have a much different picture of the story you're telling. So here's the possibility space without compromises. Here's the possibility space with compromises. As soon as you get something to a level, you can keep it there for the rest of the game, and you can always sort of preserve And again, that's not to say that this is better in and of itself, but it does give the player more opportunities to impact the narrative. So in the previous system, again, the player was just rearranging the same 15 points throughout the game. So at the top, you can see the totals. It's just the same amount of points. But in the new system, if you use a compromise in each chapter, then you see that here, for example, the parenthood rating of 5 stayed the same instead of going down. And so if you use these carefully throughout the whole game, then you can slowly increase their happiness. And by the end of the game, you've got 24 points in the system, and you can actually have a happy ending for everybody because you manage your points, and you're a good person, and you love them all, and extra effort pays off, and life is awesome. So the compromise system, I would say, is definitely my favorite piece of message through design in the game because it maps a real-world inspiration, which is making the extra effort, into a game system of making the extra effort and being careful and being skillful in your gameplay. And it pays off in the narrative layer. So it kind of all comes together to create a message that I was much more comfortable with in the game. So at this point, I had a simulation that was in line with the message I wanted to send. Players had good feedback about the status of these relationships. The story had a definable shape. The characters responded in ways that were believable in the edge cases. And the gameplay was mapped to this idea of relational effort. And it wasn't easy, but with careful and skillful play, you actually could get a happy ending for every character. So I felt like I had finally gotten the lights working and was looking at my beautiful house and felt proud of what I'd done, but it, of course, didn't quite work out that way. Because I worked so hard to hide these numbers from the characters, and I always thought that was a good idea, or from players. I always thought that was a good idea. I never wanted you to be thinking of these meters when you're playing. I always wanted it to be focused on story and characters and not the simulation. And that ended up working against me in this case. So let's look at an example. So here's a playthrough where so far the player has chosen the novel twice, and he's done a compromise once for Tommy and once for Linda. So he's got up to 17 points in this system. So far, so good. He's playing it the right way. But what if he chooses the novel again? Well, you can't go higher than 9, but the marriage and parenthood scores are still subject to the same rules. So all of a sudden, the player has done what they perceive to be the right thing, and what the game is saying is the right thing, and yet you've actually lost a point from the system. And the problem is that even players who are engaging with the game and playing the right way and trying to make the good choices, and even when the on-screen feedback was saying they were making the right choices, they were under the hood sort of getting failed by the system itself because there wasn't enough dynamic range in the system. And even when players became aware of how the system worked at a high level and really tried to game it, people were like, okay, I'll do Dan, Linda, Tommy, Dan, Linda, Tommy, and just try to cycle through the game and try to keep everything in balance. I kind of got sort of caught off guard by the fact that people got so emotionally wrapped up in the content of the game that they say, okay, cool, it's Tommy's chapter, and they get ready to go, and they're like, oh, man, I got to choose Linda here. They're like, oh, man, because the actual just subject matter of the chapter would make them feel like, oh, my God, I can't not take her side, even though I know I'm supposed to give this one to Tommy. And so they would end up, sometimes this would lead them to bump into the ceiling and without knowing it, basically take points out of the system and make things worse because in a weird way it was bad that they were connecting emotionally with the material from a purely number standpoint, I guess. So if you did this only twice in the game, you lost 4 points from the system because every time you hit the ceiling, you lose a point, but then it takes another chapter to get that point back. So if you do that twice, you can only get up to 20 instead of 24. And if you see there, with only 20 points in the system, one character still gets a bad ending. So this is a huge bummer because players often played the game well, and yet they still ended up with one character who had an unhappy ending, which was never my intent. And in fact, the game had kind of gotten back to where I was sending this unintentional message that is not what I wanted to say about life, but unfortunately, this is one that I did not realize until after the game was released. So I started seeing reviews and getting feedback from players saying that there's no way to have a happy ending, someone's always let down, it's this depressing thing, and I was confused. I was like, what are you talking about? You can make everybody happy. I built the game that way. It's supposed to work that way. Why are you guys playing it wrong? Which, of course, is idiotic on my part. But in the end, I realized I had left this glitch, essentially a glitch in the system that made it possible to play the game well and yet have the game send the exact message that I had tried to avoid. And the hell of it is, it wouldn't have even been that hard to fix. Like, it's a very small thing, but I just didn't understand the scope of the problem until after it was released. Like, I knew it could happen, but I was like, oh, yeah, but If you just get to 9, just don't pick that one again. But then that was because I was sitting here thinking as the person who understands the system, as opposed to a player who none of this is exposed to. And I had sort of assumed a level of familiarity that wasn't actually realistic. That said, I can rationalize this away. You can argue that scoring system is actually partially fair, because to get there, you do have to really zero in on one of those relationships for like 3 chapters in a row. And if you do that, you are kind of neglecting the other people, and maybe you do get what you asked for. And so maybe that mitigates some of the problem, even though ultimately I do think that's still a flaw in the game. So in the end, the mistake there was just assuming that players had knowledge of the systems that they didn't, and that they understood it to a degree that they had no way of understanding it, and that was just bad on my part. And so despite going to great lengths to hide the scoring and making it analog, that actually worked against me. So that's a bummer. But frankly, the more I think about it, because this is something that really I've only been experienced with the game since it came out, I think if given the choice, I would rather err on the side of having choices be a little more difficult and having the consequences being a little harsher. Because frankly, I don't want it to be too easy to get a happy ending, because meaningful choices are the root of memorable experiences for the players. And if they're a little too harsh, that I wish they weren't like that, but that might make players think more about those choices and put a little more thought into it and connect with it a little more. And in life, it's hard to have it all, and sometimes there is a system that works against you in ways that you don't even know. So I've kind of halfway talked myself into this bug being a subconsciously intentional feature and not a bug, but it's a bug. but the more I tell myself that, the more I'll say it was my authorial intent, and you guys just don't understand my brilliance and all that. So anyway, here I want to finish with a couple other lessons and conclusions that I got from working on the game. Creating a dynamic narrative is really, really, really hard. I thought it would be hard when I set out, and it was even harder than I expected, because it's really, really difficult to take away some fundamental assumptions about how game stories are authored and then work backwards so that the player still perceives it as the same type of narrative they're used to getting. Because players don't give a crap how it works. They just want to have a good story and a good experience. So it's on you to try to make as much of that happen as possible while still doing all your weird aspirational stuff under the hood to try to make a different type of game. So it was very, very difficult, and I felt like I was constantly battling uphill to take these under the hood simulations and really feed them back to the player and construct a story out of it instead of it just being this idea of system soup. It also doesn't save much work. I had this naive idea when I started that since it was rooted in a simulation, character relationships, there would actually be less work than authoring, even a branching story, even a linear story, because I was like, well, I can take a lot of, advantages of, procedural stuff and systemic stuff, but the way that I built my story, I had to account for all of the outcomes in all of the chapters. So every chapter I had to have Dan's good, middle, and bad outcome, and Linda's good, middle, and bad, and Tommy's good, middle, and bad. And with Linda and Tommy, when they speak up for each other, I actually had to have their conditional ones too. So they had 5 outcomes per chapter. So I had to build 13 outcomes for 9 chapters. And so it didn't really actually save any amount of time. And I bet it was a wash compared to doing this as a traditional branching story. I do think it has other advantages, but it definitely didn't save me the kind of work that I thought it did. And this last one's important too. The feedback burden is really, really, really high with this kind of thing. When a game has a non-standard narrative loop and when the story reacts to player choices based on these personal values, you have to use every possible channel to tell the player what's going on. This was a battle that I had constantly throughout development, and every build, the first build I sent out, people were like, I literally don't know what's happening. I do not know what's going on with this game. I can't figure it out. It's a confusing mess. And so I added one set of things and the next set of things, and I added the act breaks, and then I added memory stuff, and then I constantly was sort of backfilling to try to create enough feedback so players would even just literally understand the game itself. When you're doing an authored plot, even a branching one, you can control what the player sees and when. You can guarantee they're going to get to this point and get this piece of narrative information. But when you're trying to build this out of a simulation like I was trying to do, you can't take a lot of stuff for granted, and you can't really funnel the player too much. So you have to just basically take advantage of every channel you can to try to get your point across to the player. And you basically have to scrap and claw for every piece of feedback that you can find. So I tried to litter it all over the game, and it took a lot of work to get there. But the last point is, I think it was all worth it. I don't regret building the game this way. Players got really invested with the subject matter, and they had really, really personal experiences with it. I know it sounds like a cliche, but a lot of game reviewers talked about how the game made them cry multiple times. I get emails from players sharing their personal experiences with the game, and people who have reconciled with their partners over playing the game and it making them think about how they treat other people. I've had people reconsider how they interact with their families and change their behavior based on seeing how their choices affect others. And so that really means a lot to me. And I think that those emotional responses from people really come from the fact that when you give players the ability to put their own values and choices into a story in a real way, I think they recognize that and they value it and they understand it. And when they get that kind of personal experience, they know it's not something that can come from another medium. And that really means a lot to players. And so I think this is really something that's worth pursuing. And finally, I just think it's important to take risks and try to find new ways of doing things. Like, my game certainly is not perfect, but my hope is that people will take some inspiration from it and learn, maybe even if you just learned one thing from it. It would be cool, to see people take some of this stuff further and continue to take games into places that only games can go, because it's important to take risks, even if they don't work out the way you thought. You can still learn a lot, and I learned a lot over the course of this game. So, in the end, I'm glad I made it, and I'm very proud of it, and I hope that what I learned in making it will be helpful to you all as well. So thank you very much. And I don't know if we have time for Q&A or if anybody has questions, but it's, 5. Oh, look, who are you now?
My name's Clint.
Oh, hi.
I have one question. With regards to the compromise system, to build on your example, Chevy Chase has to, I forget his name in the movies, but whatever. He has to, learn to better empathize with the people in his family and learn to see why they're upset or why they're not getting along with each other, and he has to improve himself by examining himself and changing his behavior and working harder, I think,
right,
as you put it,
yeah,
in order to fix those things and get a happy outcome. In the Novelist, Dan doesn't go through that process.
Right.
You go through that process as a player, but then the way you work harder is, instead of by trying to be more empathetic or trying to help people with their challenges, you do it by sneaking from light bulbs and trying to not be seen and trying to dig down an exploration tree to find hidden puzzle pieces. So do you think that there's something dissonant there, or something that could be better developed in order to put what the player's doing when he's bringing his relationship management skills to bear in line with the skills he's actually leveraging as a player?
I think that's a good point. The one thing that I would say does mirror that process a little bit is the fact that you don't have to find everybody's clues to go through the game. You can, if you show up in a chapter and be like, oh man, I just want to do what Dan wants, you can just mainline his clue chain and go straight ahead. So if you decide that you want to empathize with those other people, you have to go through the steps of finding out everything about them. So you actually have to discover what they want. You don't just get it handed to you. So I think that mirrors it some. And so, but that's probably fairly metaphorical within the game. I don't know how to make Dan have an empathy process, but I do think that as a player, recognizing that you have this ability, and then having to do that extra work and say, okay, not only do I feel bad about what happened to Linda last chapter, I'm going to really do the work to find out what she wants this chapter. I think that mirrors some of that. But one of the weirdest things that I noticed is that watching people play, some people will earn a compromise and then not use them, which is weird, because I put a lot of training to remind you that you have them when you can use them, and people are like, no, I'm not going to do that. And it's like, why? Don't you understand that you can make people happier? And no. It's that's a very weird thing. I don't know how to explain that, but I do think that clue discovery process is some of what you're talking about.
Hi.
Hello.
So I was wondering, after you've tried to create this system and decided to not going to the authorial route, and you know how when you go authorial, like putting together a story where the main character really changes and has his weaknesses and goes through like many things to like have the final change, his final decision. That's very difficult to put together something that's good, that the audience will watch or will read, and they'll have closure at the end. So after you've tried the other route, when you see yourself working on your next game, are you gonna still push for that other route? Are you gonna not compromise, but like try to blend both routes? How do you see that for your future games?
So just to be clear, you're contrasting the more authorial types of linear or branching stories where you do see the character specifically go through that arc versus this style, which that doesn't happen, is what you're asking. The thing, I have no idea what game I'm going to make next. It's definitely not going to be nearly as heavy because this is too hard to work on. The name The Novelist is a little bit, and some of the visual metaphors of the game where you see the words come up and be typed out describing what happened. It's a almost unveiled, not even veiled metaphor for you, the player, being the person who's going through that process. And so, to me, it wasn't so much Dan. It was never important to me for Dan specifically to go through that process because the thing I was hoping for, and the thing that a lot of players found, was that they were the ones who that happened to when they went through. They came in with one set of assumptions, and then they started seeing the way people reacted to it. They actually had to like, oh my God, maybe I should think this way, or oh my God, I never really realized how strongly I felt about that, or whatever. So I think that the same process happened, just maybe in two different places. And in this game, it's a little bit more personal and more metaphorical, as opposed to going along for the ride on a linear story, which can be awesome as well. But yeah, does that answer your question at all? I mean, But going forward, I honestly don't know. I mean, my bias is always towards this type of thing. I've just always been a very systemic. Like, I'm not a writer. I came from a systems design background. I had to learn how to write to make this game. Like, so this is not natural to me at all. So that's why I did a story from a nerdy, systemic standpoint.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hello.
Hi, I have a question. I was wondering if so in the simulation, it seems that in each chapter you have a decision, and regardless of whom you pick, like the numbers kind of go in the same, well, I mean, barring compromises, but what I mean is that the weight of the decisions, like maybe, did you consider that there could be a decision where if you missed this deadline, you might really get screwed, for instance, so maybe like the score would fall more than that? And then at the same time, like instead of having particular, author chapters, that it could be sort of like a randomly drawn card event that would define some of these things.
Yes. So to the first question, which was basically about should different chapters have had maybe different or more weighted scoring, I considered that, and I thought about doing it with the major chapters, those act break chapters. But as you see, as I explained, like the dynamic range of the system is actually pretty small. And so I was like, if I had given you a 3-point boost and you were at a 7, then all of a sudden you would even bust further out of the system. So I ultimately shied away from that. There's one example, or one exception to that. The final chapter of the game is structured a little bit differently than the previous 8, and it actually does have different scoring. And I actually, the scoring was a little too harsh in the shipping version, so whenever I did an update in February, I silently made it less harsh. So yeah, I do that one time. It's the final ending that projects forward in the game. So it is something I thought about, but I was scared that it would be too disruptive during the middle part of the game. And then I've forgotten your second question. What was it again?
The second question is, I suppose I could probably answer it. I imagine that it has to do with authorship, like that you would have had to create a lot more content, but that for replay value, you could there would be an option of like each chapter could be like a randomly drawn situation that would define some of these. Yeah,
I thought about some of that too, and people suggested that because the game is very rigid. It's a very rigid game. You do some stuff and you get a decision. You do some stuff and you get a decision, and it's the same process over time, and that's one of the valid criticisms of the game. And I thought about trying to do that kind of thing, and actually I think Zach might have suggested something like that at some point. I think in some of your feedback, I'm putting this on you now. Do you want to answer this question? No, but there some people suggested that, and I don't even remember why I didn't do it, but I think I was just scared that I was trying to get away from that process of system soup and like having really numbersy and really really tweaky stuff. I was trying to get away from that, and it was very hard, even with the rigid structure, to create a story. So I was a little worried that doing that kind of, because that's the stuff that works great in The Sims or other games like that. But I think it was just more that I was trying to do as little of that as possible for the sake of it being a narrative, as opposed to being a little bit more, oh, I've got this compromise point in my back pocket. I'll just throw it to you or whatever. So I just think it didn't fit with this specific game, but it's not a bad idea overall.
Cool. Thank you.
No problem. So we have 2 minutes. This is apparently the last question to all the ghosts that are standing in line.
I have a comment and a question regarding people who don't take up compromises. I did that once when I played through, and there was one time.
Monster.
I know. Well, I was like, I thought, like, you guys are stupid. I don't want to do that for you. It's just, I don't know.
Well, that's your experience, and that's fine.
I'm not criticizing you, of course. I'm just saying, like, that was my experience when I was playing. Once in a while, I was just like, oh, why do you want that? No. So that
that's
happened.
Good. You made your own decision.
Yeah,
that's great.
I was getting into it, right? I was getting emotionally invested. So it's it's a compliment, not a bad thing. But that's an answer to why that might happen. You know,
awesome.
That was what happened for me. The question I have for you is a little bit broad. I was curious if you were, I know you said you wanted to back away from something like this for your next game, but if you were to explore what would be like the next step in dynamic narrative, what would you kind of try to poke at?
Well, I would try to find something that was a little less rigid structurally, like, and some of that, 1 minute, and some of that might be, man, 1 minute, I just drew a blank. I had a good point, too. So some of that could just be relaxing the structure of the game, obviously fixing some of the issues with the dynamic range of the game. I would also want to have a little bit more change in the game. Like one of the knocks is like the game takes place in one house for the whole summer, so that gets really boring. So I think you could do interesting stuff if you put them in different situations, or if you had a scenario where someone's out of town and there's only 2 characters there, and you kind of had a little bit more variation to the experience. But overall, I think I would just keep playtesting, and I'm a big iterative person, so I would probably just keep playtesting and trying to find different little bugs and quirks with the system, and try to open it up more and make it a little more, I don't know, a little less rigid, I think would be a good thing. So yeah,
Cool.
All right, I think that's it. 0 minutes. All right. Thank you very much for coming.